Go ahead and turn in your Bibles to Exodus chapter 15. Exodus chapter 15. I'm not going to read out of Exodus 15 right here at the beginning. I'm going to read actually out of Deuteronomy, but that will be on the screen, and so I want you to see that on the screen, but I want you to be ready in Exodus 15 when we jump into the sermon a little bit later. So Exodus 15, verse 22 is where you can put your eyes, and I'm going to read to us out of Deuteronomy 8. Deuteronomy 8, 11 through 16. God's word says, "Take care lest you forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments and his rules and his statutes, which I command you today. Lest when you have eaten and are full and have built good houses and live in them, and when your herds and flocks multiply and your silver and gold is multiplied and all that you have is multiplied, then your heart be lifted up and you forget the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, who led you through the great and terrifying wilderness with its fiery serpents and scorpions and thirsty ground where there was no water, who brought you water out of the flinty rock, who fed you in the wilderness with manna that your fathers did not know, that he might humble you and test you to do you good in the end." Well, today we are beginning part 2 of our Exodus series. If you haven't been with us, we have been in Exodus since April, something like that. It's been a minute, okay? And we're on Exodus 15 through 17 today, and we've got to get all the way to Exodus 40. So we're actually going to pick it up a little bit in the coming weeks, and so we'll be here till October. But part 1 ended last week. It ended with the people of God crossing the Red Sea, and now in part 2, we're going to see God's people journey through the wilderness. So before we jump into part 2, let me give you 2 big takeaways from part 1 in Exodus. This is something when you think about the first 15 chapters, part 1 of Exodus, what should I think about? What should I remember? And here's our first thing that we learned in part 1 of Exodus. God desires to be known and to be known through us. So God desires to be known, and he desires to be known through us. If you remember, he pulls Moses aside all the way back in Exodus chapter 3, and he begins to reveal who he is. And we learn that God is infinite, and we are finite. We learn that God knows all things, that there is nothing that is unknown to God. We learn that he is sufficient within himself. He does not need anything to survive. How many of you went to sleep last night? I see a couple of the kiddos didn't raise their hands. God did not go to sleep last night. He never sleeps. He doesn't need sleep, but we do. You and I, we need food to survive. God does not. We learned that God is self-defining, that you and I don't get to take our little box of what we think God should be like, but rather, God is who he is. He alone defines himself and his attributes. Everything and everyone else in the universe is defined by God. This is who you are. This is what this is. This is what that is. God is the only one who is self-defining. And our temptation is that we would make God into our image. But what we found out in Exodus, at the first part of Exodus, is that he is not made in our image. We are made in God's image. That's why God says, "I am who I am. I be who I be," that he revealed his personal name to us at the beginning of Exodus, the Lord. He is Yahweh. He is personal to us, that we are in relationship with the all-powerful, self-defining God. And throughout the first 15 chapters, he has been calling his people into relationship with him. He heard their cries, he knows their sufferings, and he came down to deliver them. We learned that God does all things so that the world would know his glory, that he sent plague after plague. He dismantled the gods of Egypt, and he freed his people so that the world would see his glory. And he used the Israelites to display that glory, that through their deliverance, his name was proclaimed. And it's the same with us. God's purpose has not changed. He desires to display his glory, and he will use his people to do it. That through our deliverance, through Jesus Christ, he is displaying to the world who he is. So first, God desires to be known and to be known through you. And second, God's plan is perfect, but our journey within that plan can feel unpredictable. So God's plan is perfect, but our journey through that plan can feel unpredictable. Over and over, we saw in the first 15 chapters that God had a plan. God is working out a plan. That plan is perfect, it's good, but it rarely plays out how we think it's going to play out. Amen? And throughout these first 15 chapters, we saw the people of God groan. We saw them question. We saw them doubt the plan of God. But when they got to the other side of the Red Sea, what happened? They worshiped because God's plan had been unfolded. Sometimes in the midst of God unfolding his plan in our lives, we are left confused. We are left concerned. We can identify the pain in the midst of it. We can identify the doubt. But what we learn is that if we would trust God in faith, in his unfolding plan, then he will shape us into who he wants us to be. So if those are the takeaways from part one, what is the big picture of part two, what we're going to begin today? I think I would summarize it like this. What does it mean to belong to the God who has made himself known? What does it mean to belong to the God who has made himself known? What does it mean to day in and day out walk in the deliverance of God? How does that practically play out in our lives? We're especially going to see that today. The book of Exodus mirrors our lives in many ways. The first 15 chapters is the journey to the Exodus. It's God's bringing of salvation. They were enslaved, and now they have been set free through a mediator, that someone stood in the gap between man and God set them free. And we too, we are in need of an Exodus, just like the Egyptians. And Jesus, our mediator, put on flesh, fully God, fully man, came and saved us. And through his death and resurrection, he has brought us freedom. And so now, after salvation, comes the question, okay, what does that mean for us? What do we do with this salvation? It's the same question that the Israelites are asking today. Now what? What do we do? How are we supposed to live? How are we supposed to think? How are we supposed to believe? You can put it this way. The first 15 chapters of the book of Exodus is about getting the Israelites, the people of God, out of Egypt. The remaining chapters are getting Egypt out of the Israelites. And so for us, our Exodus from slavery to freedom, God has brought us salvation. He has brought us out of slavery. And the rest of our lives is that sanctification, getting that slavery out of us. That we would not belong to sin anymore. We would not belong to the things of the world. We would not belong to Egypt. He's getting it out of us and making us holy every single day. When you are saved by God's grace, you are delivered. But your story does not end there. Now, that's just the beginning. After salvation comes growth and sanctification. And that is what God is going to begin to do here in part two, and it's going to be messy, just like we are. He is going to mold them. He's going to shape them. He's going to instruct them and build them into people of faith. In fact, we read it right at the beginning. Why did God lead them into the wilderness? That he might humble you and test you and do you good in the end. It's the same with us. For the rest of your life, God will humble you. He will test you, but he will do you good in the end. So today we're going to look at three different moments from chapters 15 to 18, three moments where God is going to begin to sanctify his people and begin the process of making them holy. And all three of these moments are going to reveal their discontent hearts. That instead of trusting God in gratitude, they're going to respond with grumbling. So here's what we are going to do, okay? First, we're going to look at their discontent hearts. What does grumbling reveal about them? They're going to grumble. And so that is going to be the topic for today. I'm sorry. I'm also excited. And we're going to look after that at how God responds to their grumbling and what he is trying to teach them. So let's pick it up in Exodus 15, verse 22. This is our first moment. Verse 22, Exodus 15. Then Moses made Israel set out from the Red Sea, and they went into the wilderness of Shur. They went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink the water of Marah because it was bitter. Therefore, it was named Marah. And the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" So here we have the people of God. They have just crossed the Red Sea. They just had, think about it, the most amazing experience that anyone could ever ask for. They just walked through the Red Sea on dry land. They were just singing God's praises. And how long did it take for them to begin to question God? 3 days. 3 days. I mean, they saw gnats, they saw frogs, they saw flies, they saw locust, disease, hail, darkness, death. They followed God in a cloud, through a cloud, and a pillar of fire. They saw wonders. Took 3 days. 3 days to turn from grace into grumbling. When I was a youth minister, we'd take our students to youth camp every year, and every camp had a similar cadence, right? Day 1 and 2, all the kids were crazy. I mean, trying to sneak energy drinks into their room. I mean, doing all sorts of crazy stuff. They just wanted to have fun. All the spiritual stuff they were not interested in. But by day 4, after spending almost every minute singing worship songs, reading their Bible, praying, and setting themselves before the Lord, their affections would start to get stirred. They would confess their sin. They would start crying, holding hands around the campfire, singing Kumbaya. I mean, it was just this revival every time. But on the way home, as soon as they got hungry, they turned into tiny little monsters, okay? It usually took about 30 minutes. What are we going to eat? They won't stop hitting me. How much longer, right? It took them about 30 minutes. And here's the deal. You know, when I started working with adults several years ago, I thought, man, I'm so excited to work with adults. You guys are worse, okay? So before we start pointing fingers at the young people, oh, you adults. And I'm like that too. We're all like that. We're no different, right? It doesn't take long for us to move from experiencing and living within God's grace to turn into a people who really like to grumble and complain. I mean, we look at our jobs, our relationships, our marriage. Maybe you look at your kids' behavior, and we just start to complain. We start to grumble, and we quickly forget what God has done in the past. We forget his faithfulness in the past, and we question his sovereignty in the present. So the people of God have been traveling for 3 days. They have no water. So granted, okay, this isn't a 14-year-old complaining about their Red Bull on the way home. This is a real trial. We need water to survive. So they finally find water, and what happens? It's bitter. They spit it out, right? And it had to taste really bad because they hadn't had water in 3 days. And they decided that this water is not good enough. It can't satisfy me. So they grumble to Moses. Hey, what are we going to drink? And it's a fair question, to be honest. It's a fair question. And look, I want to make something clear. It's never a sin to cast your burdens onto God. It's never a sin to cast your burdens onto God. In fact, we are commanded to do that, and we should do that. But what is a sin is when we bring our questions in a spirit of grumbling, in a spirit of complaint. If you'll notice here, the posture of Moses and the posture of the people is very different. One grumbles while the other surrenders their need to the Lord. Look at verse 25. It says, Moses cried to the Lord. So when Moses cries to the Lord, it accomplishes more than an entire people complaining. Isn't that interesting? Let's look at number 2. We're going to go through these grumbling really quick. In moment number 2, we find the people of God with no food now. So they don't have water, now they don't have any food. And in this moment, they completely lose it. Exodus 16, verse 1. It says, they set out from Elim, and all the congregation of the people of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the 2nd month after they had departed from the land of Egypt. And the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the people of Israel said to them, would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full, for you have brought us out into the wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. They essentially say, have you just brought us out here to die? Like, at least back in Egypt, we had meat. They look back on their slavery and they say, yeah, no, that was better. That was better. And then in our third moment, in Exodus 17, verse 1, it says, all the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of Sin by stages, according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim. But when there was no water for the people to drink, therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, give us water to drink. And Moses said to them, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord? But the people thirsted there for water, and the people grumbled against Moses and said, why did you bring us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? So Moses cried to the Lord. What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me. So now it's not just that they are grumbling, they are quarreling. I mean, they are so amped up. Moses says, hey, they're ready to stone me. They're literally ready to throw rocks at me and kill me. And so you see in each of these moments that every time the people of God, every time they face a trial, every time they face a difficult circumstance, their natural inclination is to not trust God. Their disposition is to grumble against their circumstances. When things are going well, they sing worship. They sing worship songs to God. But when their faith is tested, they grumble, they complain. So let me ask you a question. Why did the people of God so quickly grumble despite the faithfulness they had seen from the Lord? Why did they question the Lord's provision when he had already provided so much? Let's just for a second think about what the Israelites are facing, okay? Because let's not be too hard on them, because I think that I am a lot like them. I think that we're a lot like them. We tend to grumble when the outcome of our circumstances are unclear. We tend to grumble when the outcome of our circumstances are unclear. When we begin to wonder, when this is all over, am I going to be okay? When we look ahead and we aren't sure what's there. If they had a map that said, okay, here is water, here is food, perhaps they would not have grumbled. But they didn't, so the outcome was unclear. See, slavery was a known. They knew what slavery meant. Freedom meant living by faith, trusting in the unknown. And that's why I think so many people run back to the world after having seeming to have an encounter with the Lord, because slavery is a known. It makes sense. I may not love living in it, but at least I know what to expect. Faith can be terrifying. They didn't know where they were, and they didn't know where they were going. I heard someone say it this way once. Having a baby in a hospital is scary, but at least you know why you're there. Now, I can't confirm that or deny that, obviously. You'll have to ask the experts, the women in the room. But if you're in the hospital and you're having a baby, at least you know why you're there. If you go there for stomach pain or chest pain and you don't know why you're there, that can be terrifying. So the people here, they didn't know where they were going or why they were in the wilderness. We tend to grumble when we are unsure where we are headed. And we also tend to grumble when we don't like our circumstances, when we face adversity, when we don't have control. We don't typically complain when everything is good. We complain when it seems that our circumstances are against us. And there's a very important distinction between a groan and a grumble. Because some of you right now can honestly say, hey, look, I've got some really difficult things going on in my life. Life's really hard right now. A diagnosis, I'm having a difficult time in my marriage, with a relationship, with my kids. And it's tempting to think, okay, if I'm not supposed to grumble, am I just supposed to put on a smile and act like everything's okay? Now, the Bible is filled with people who bring their groans to God. Groaning to God and grumbling to God are two very different things. A groan, someone who groans, comes to God with hands open. Oh, Lord, what are you teaching me here? What are you molding me to be? What do you want my mind to think? What do you want my heart to feel? A grumble comes with fists clenched. Lord, why? Who do you think you are? I've been so good to you. Why are you doing this to me? What is this about? And it's a spirit of disobedience. It's that idea that they come to this food, they've got no water, no food, and they say, can you believe that God would do this to us? Can you believe that he wouldn't give us food, that he wouldn't give us water? I remember before I went to college, before I came as a freshman, I prayed that the Lord would give me just the best roommate. I had heard stories of people who had been friends with their roommate for like 40 years. And so I prayed and prayed, I said, God, give me someone that I can be just really good friends with. And so I walk into our dorm my freshman year, and this dude has, and I'm not knocking these things, this dude has like theater pictures and music artists and all these things that I just was not interested in at the time. So I saw that and I was like, okay, surely we have something in common. Like I can find something in common with anybody, right? So I start to ask him questions. Hey, do you like sports? No. It's like, okay, let me ask a simpler one that he's going to say yes to. Do you like Lord of the Rings? No. It's like, okay, all right. So then I was like, let me throw this guy a softball, okay? Do you like Whataburger? No. What? I'm like, bro, we can't. this isn't going to work, right? So later on that semester, I was complaining about that guy to one of my mentors, and I was like, okay, well, he does this, and he won't do this, and he won't do this. And finally, he said to me, Colton, maybe the problem isn't him. Maybe the problem is your belief that in order for you to love someone, they have to be who you want them to be. And that stung, because he was right. If they didn't fit into my little box, then in my mind, they weren't worthy of my love. And here's the thing. For the rest of the world, it may be normal and even expected for them to complain about circumstances in their lives. But for the people of God who have been rescued from slavery and death and given new life, for us to complain shows a lack of gratitude, and it shows contempt for our Maker. It's coming to God with hands clenched and saying, God, I don't like this, and your plan isn't matching my plan, so you're in the wrong here. It's interesting, in our second moment, when the people are hungry and they start complaining again, they're complaining to Moses, and he tells them this. He says, whoa. You think that I'm the problem, but deep down, your issue isn't with me. Your issue is with the Lord. You and him aren't okay. And that's such an important note because so many times we want to focus our discontentment on other people. You might say, well, my problem isn't with God. It's just I wish my spouse would be more like this. I wish my kids would do more of this. I wish my friend wouldn't be like this. And we put our discontentment on other people. And you know what? Maybe they do need to change some things, but deep down, your problem isn't with them. It's with the Lord, because grumbling is a sign of contempt for your Maker. It's a lack of gratitude. If I came to your house and you cooked me a meal and I smelled it and I went, oh, that smells disgusting. And then I said, no offense. Would that be weird? Yeah, of course that's offensive, right? If you criticize the food, you criticize the cook. If you criticize your circumstances, you're criticizing the one who put you there. And instead of groaning to God, instead of talking to God, you are accusing him because you know better. And that's a problem for two reasons. One, for the believer to have a spirit of grumbling is to say, God, I don't trust that your authority over me is good. It's to forsake our call to surrender to God who has dominion over our lives and to deny that dominion is good. And second, for the believer to have a spirit of grumbling is to deny our proclamation of God's glory and what he can do in our lives. And it's to present ourselves as the hero of the story. A grumbler makes a declaration to the world that God does not matter. All that matters is my circumstances. Because a person who knows how to groan, like we see with a David or Moses, someone who comes with open hands, a person who knows how to groan gives much glory to God in the midst of any circumstances. Because if the world doesn't see us looking at him in the midst of our difficulties, then we are declaring that the purpose of life is centered on me and not on his glory, his love, and his purposes. And in grumbling, we rob God of his due praise, and we miss the opportunity to be an ambassador for the gospel. So then the question is, okay, if we are not to be a grumbling people, then what kind of people should we be? If one of the results of a discontent heart is a heart that grumbles, then what is the result of a heart that trusts God? And here's what I would say. A person who trusts God has a heart that is filled with unbelievable gratitude. Charles Spurgeon, the great preacher, once preached, I have a great need for Christ, and I have a great Christ for my need. And for the person that has experienced the grace of Christ in the midst of our need, what will come out of us is not grumbling, but gratitude. Like, what if the people, when they realized they had no water, they would have reminded each other, friends, do you remember when we were enslaved? Do you remember what God did? Do you remember the frogs and the hail and the gnats and the darkness? When they tasted the bitter water, what if they would have prayed, God, we have seen what you have done. We have seen how you have freed us. Could you make this bitter water sweet? Gratitude produces faith. I believe that you can do it, God. Gratitude removes the scales of self off of our eyes and helps us to see the goodness of God. Now, how does God respond to their groaning? Does he punish them? I remember several years ago, I went to a friend's house for dinner. We sat down to eat, and one of their kids did not want to eat the spaghetti in front of them. This isn't anybody in this church, just FYI. And the more they told him to eat, the more he stood his ground and he just grumbled. He didn't want to eat this spaghetti. He didn't want to eat his food. He eventually threw his hands up and the plate of spaghetti went all over the table. And then in shame and anger, he crawled under the table to hide. And remember, I'm here. I don't know these people that well. And I'm watching this whole thing and I'm like, oh man, this kid's going to get it. Like, I'm looking at the dad like, you're going to spank him, aren't you? Yeah, you're going to spank him. And I just watched. And I remember this dad, he got out of his chair and he crawled under the table with his son. And under the table, I could hear his dad talking to him with just such gentleness, just talking to his son. And then after a couple minutes, the son and the dad got up. The son sat in his chair and just started eating his food. And I was like, what in the world did I just watch? Right? I've thought of it. I mean, it's 15 years later and I'm still thinking about it, right? The kid apologized, started eating his dinner. What does God do with his people? Does he scream at them? Does he punish them? No. We see the mercy of God in sanctification. He wants to grow them. And he'll do that through his love. In our first moment, we see God respond. In verse 25, it says, Moses cried to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a log, and he threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. He shows Moses this log, and Moses throws this log into the water, and the bitter water became sweet. It's interesting. God is recreating the miracle of the Red Sea here. What happened at the Red Sea? They thought they were going to die, and Moses puts a wooden staff into the sea, and it parts. What happens here? They think they're going to die, so Moses puts a piece of wood in water and turns it sweet. They are meant to remember his faithfulness from 3 days before. Just like that kid remembered, hey, this is my dad. He loves me. He gets under the table with me, and he talks to me. The same God who was faithful back then is faithful now. And it's not an accident, by the way, that the word bitter is used here. It's the same word, if you remember, that was used back in Exodus chapter 1 to describe the people of God. Exodus 1:13. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service. And here in chapter 15, God is showing them that he has moved them from bitter to sweet. If you will trust me, you will experience sweet water. God is teaching them to come to him with their needs, that God will take the bitter and he will make it sweet. So how do we, as a people who live in gratitude instead of people who grumble, how do we live? I think the first thing for us is that we taste the sweetness of salvation. He's moved us from bitter to sweet. He's taken you from the bitterness of sin and into the sweetness of his grace. For a person who has experienced the sweetness of salvation, to walk in bitterness is evidence that you don't understand just how wonderful the grace of God is. God's grace breeds gratitude in our lives because it's unbelievable. God, thank you for today. Thank you for your word. Thank you for your love. Thank you for Jesus on the cross. So that's our first moment. What is God teaching them in our second moment? Remember, they are hungry, and so they start to grumble, and what does God do? Exodus 16:4. Then the Lord said to Moses, behold, I am about to rain bread from heaven for you. And the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day that I might test them, whether they will walk in my law or not. God says, I'm going to rain down manna from heaven. And by the way, if you read it, this bread isn't like some kind of crusty old bread. This is like a sweet bread. It's like a pastry. It's like going to Shipley's, okay? Probably not. But it's kind of bread. It's the kind of bread that you eat and you sit back and you go, oh, that's the stuff. That's good, right? But here's the deal. This manna, this bread, is only going to last for a day. It's only going to last for a day at a time. That's what he tells them in verse 19. This manna is going to require you to trust that God will provide today, and then again tomorrow, and then again the next day. That's why the leftover manna, we're told in verse 21, melted away, right? And he told them, hey, gather only as much as you need for today. And it's a hard lesson for the Israelites to learn. They trust their efforts. They trust their savings. They trust their provision. So they go and they gather more than what they need, and they go to bed and they look at that pot of manna saved for tomorrow, and that makes them feel okay. But the next morning, it's full of maggots. God is teaching them there is no alternative than to trust me to provide for today, but also to provide for tomorrow. The exception is the seventh day. The Sabbath is to be a day of rest, so the people are to gather twice as much on the sixth day. The Sabbath, too, we learn then, is an invitation to trust God, and the Sabbath is a hard lesson for them to learn as well. It says in verse 27, some of the people went out on the seventh day to gather it, but they found none. God said, hey, rest on the seventh day. Some people didn't believe him. They go out on the seventh day and they have nothing to eat. One of the ways in which God demonstrates, one of the ways in which we demonstrate our trust in God is our ability to rest. That we can rest because we're trusting that God would provide. Let me turn that around. If you can't rest, if you're always grumbling, if there's always something that you have to complain about something, if you can't ever rest your mind and your heart in contentment with the Lord, if you're always busy with work or family, ministry, maybe it's a sign that you're not actually trusting God. You don't trust him to provide what you need, and there's no gratitude for grace in your heart. You're trying to secure your own future, create your own identity, or provide your own justification. In the desert, God is schooling his people to trust him with daily trust. Trust me that the bread that I give you is enough. Do you believe that God will give you what you need each day? Do you believe that in every circumstance and situation that he is watching over you, he is providing for you and satisfying you? Or are you always searching? Are you quick to question him, quick to take control, quick to forsake him, quick to complain? It's interesting, when you get to the Gospel of John, Jesus will point back to this moment. A group of people come up to him and they tell him, hey, give us a sign that we may believe in you. And so he points back to this moment in Exodus. So this is John 6:32. It says, Jesus then said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, it was not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is what? Is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. He says, it wasn't Moses that provided the bread, it was my Father. And so they say, hey, give us this bread. I want this bread. So here's what he tells them in John 6:48. He says, I am the bread of life. Your fathers ate manna in the wilderness and they died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven so that one may eat of it and not die. He says, I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I will give for the life of the world is what? My flesh. He says, the true bread from heaven is me. That moment in the wilderness with the manna, that moment was about me. He says, they ate the manna and they died. He says, I am the living bread. I bring life. And then he goes on to say in John 6:58, this is the bread that came down from heaven, not like the bread that the fathers ate and died. Whoever feeds on this bread will live forever. He says, if you want to live, you have to partake in my body. That we are remembering that in order for us to have life, we must eat the bread of life, that he died so that we would have life. He is our manna from heaven. This is why Jesus prayed, by the way, and the Lord's Prayer, give us what? Give us our daily bread, right? Who is that bread? Jesus himself. Every day we look to him for peace. Every day we look to him for contentment. Every day we look to him for provision. As we partake in the bread of life, grumbling turns into gratitude. Grumbling turns into gratitude. If you are never in the Word, if you're never centering and meditating your mind on who Jesus is, what he has done, who he has called you to be, and the immeasurable weight of the grace that he has given us, if you are never focused on that, you will always be a grumbler. There will be no gratitude because you're focusing on empty idols of the world, on yourself, and that will never produce peace, joy, hope. It will only produce grumbling because you'll never be satisfied. The only one who is satisfying is Jesus himself. Our last moment. They're thirsty again, and God takes them to a rock, and God tells Moses, hey, hit it with your staff, and it will start pouring out water. In the New Testament, Paul will teach about this moment. In 1 Corinthians 10:1, Paul will say, for I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And then he says in verse 3, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Paul says the rock that they struck poured out water, and he says that rock was Christ. What does that mean? It means that if we want to be sustained, that we must drink from the water of life, and that water is Christ, the rock. To be a grumbler is to drink in sand and wonder why you're still thirsty. Never satisfied, always searching, never content with what God has given us. But the rock of Christ, he gives living water that quenches our thirst. So he was the one who was nailed to that piece of wood, and he took all the bitterness of our life and he makes it sweet. He is the one when we are starving, when we're in need, when we're wondering how we're going to survive, that he comes down from heaven as the bread of life, and in him we find our satisfaction. He was the rock that was struck on our behalf, and what pours out of him is rivers of life. So the question now is, okay, now what? What does this, these 3 moments practically mean for the church, for the people of God? I think it means in the midst of our daily lives, we should consider first the measure, that's what I was talking about earlier, the measure of his generosity through the cross. This is the beginning of gratitude. The measure of his generosity through the cross. Jesus gave everything for us. God became a man and died. He gave everything. He was betrayed so that we weren't. He was mocked. He was beaten so that we weren't. He was crucified and he died so that we did not have to die. This is how generous he is. He gave up his life for his people. And do we really think the one who gave everything he had for us would not give us everything we need? Let me say that again. Do we not think that the one who gave everything he had for us would not give everything we need? How generous is God? Look to his death. He gave all. And eternity is the vastness of the gift. What he gives is eternal life. That gift never runs out and it never wears out. The journey for the Israelites was not what they thought it would be. And the reality is the journey for your life probably isn't what you thought it would be, which is difficult. Life may not have played out like you thought it would, but our God will give us all that we need for today. He will give us all that we need for tomorrow. He will give us all that we need for the next day. And I'm not talking about physical things. He will give us himself. Philippians 2:14, Paul says, do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent. You see that? He connects grumbling with not being innocent. Do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. Did you know that the Bible mentions the word gratitude 157 times? And it mentions the word thanksgiving 72 times. There's a direct connection between understanding the grace of God and being a people filled with gratitude. If you have experienced grace, you will express gratitude. And the journey to gratitude begins with a humble groan in the midst of grace. That we reflect on who God is. That we reflect that we have indulged ourselves in sin and we have run away from him. We have rebelled against him. And we look at the grace of God and we go, wow, you did that for me? It's a groan. God, you loved me? You cared about me? You had affections for me? And that turns our groaning into gratitude in the midst of grace.